Those of us who grew up at a time when to be openly gay at school was to pin a target to one's back, Stonewall was considered to be a much-needed force for change. The resurgence of anti-gay sentiment in the wake of the AIDS crisis led to the implementation of Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988, with its prohibition in schools against the promotion or acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Stonewall has been a leading presence in the success story of gay equality. The age of consent was equalised in 2001. Section 28 was repealed in 2003. The Equality Act of 2010 guaranteed equal treatment for gay people in the workplace. And in 2013, gay marriage was legalised. Job done, you would have thought. But having won all of these battles and more, Stonewall faced a crisis of purpose. Critics have claimed that its subsequent turn to gender ideology and trans issues was because it needed to stay relevant and justify the continuation of government funding. They point out that gender identity and sexuality are two very different things, and the conflation of the two makes little sense. Supporters of Stonewall, on the other hand, argue that marginalised groups have a responsibility to support each other. And so the addition of the T to the LGB initialism was an inevitability. Yet the charity's emphasis on trans issues has come at a cost. There's been a sudden exodus of government bodies and private companies from Stonewall's Diversity Champions scheme, including the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Channel 4, Ofsted and many more. Last week, the Equalities Minister Liz Truss advised that 250 or so government departments and public bodies who were part of Stonewall's scheme to sever all ties. Ostensibly, this was a funding issue. Why pay money for consultation with Stonewall when UK discrimination law is already clear? After all, the charity's guidelines on gender-neutral pronouns and gender-neutral spaces are ideological in nature and do not accurately reflect authentic legal obligations. Truss's advice came soon after a review by the University of Essex, which determined that it was wrong to rescind the invitations of two visiting speakers, Professors Rosa Friedman and Joe Phoenix, after they had been accused of transphobia. Furthermore, the review found that the decision had been influenced by Stonewall's misrepresentation of the Equalities Act to imply that gender identity was classified as a protected characteristic. The report's author, Barrister Akua Reindorf, reached the conclusion that the charity's policy states the law as Stonewall would prefer it to be, rather than the law as it is. The problem has arisen because, whether Stonewall accepts it or not, there is a conflict between a faction of the trans lobby and gender-critical feminists. Here's what I said about this on Andrew Neil's show earlier this week. I think one of the biggest mistakes that Stonewall has made, and one of the biggest mistakes that all of the participants in this debate have made so far, is the assumption that anyone who raises concerns or has questions is doing so from a position of hate, from a position of malice, or indeed transphobia. I've met an awful lot of people who are involved in this debate. These are feminists, gender-critical feminists, and I have yet to meet one who has any prejudice or hatred towards trans people. That just isn't there. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, by the way.
Of course, it does.
Of course it does. But I think what's damaging is the assumption that anyone who wants to have a conversation about these issues must be coming from that place.
Yes.
And Stonewall have really shot themselves in the foot by interpreting it in that way, even with the head of Stonewall comparing gender-critical feminism to anti-Semitism. This isn't helpful. Teacher, journalist and transgender campaigner Debbie Hayton joins us now with her view. Debbie, thanks so much for coming onto the show.
You're welcome, Andrew.
Really appreciate it. I just want to throw a quote at you that you said. I don't mean to do a gotcha or anything like that, but this is something you said in The Spectator. You said, Labour has been held captive by Stonewall's nonsense for far too long. Is it bad? It is bad for the party and bad for our democracy. That strikes me as a bit harsh. Isn't that a bit harsh of you?
It may be harsh, but it's true, Andrew.
Could you clarify for the viewers why you think, what specifically about Stonewall's recent policies has annoyed you so much that you would call it nonsense?
Well, they've moved away from sex, which is material reality. I'm a science teacher as well as a journalist, so sex is material reality, and moved away from that as the basis of the division of humanity into men and women, into this thing called gender. So we're not sure what this terminology gender actually means.
It's probably quite helpful for people to clarify. What is the difference between sex and gender?
Well, I know what sex is. Sex is the two types of human beings that then contribute to the reproduction of the species. But what is gender? We have this debate about what gender is, but we're not sure. You know, what is gender?
Well, I mean,
is it the clothes I wear? Is it how I do my hair? Or is it something deeper? We don't know.
This strikes me as the big question. I mean, in Helen Joyce's recent book on trans, she describes it as being almost like a sexed soul. This idea that we have a gender identity that is innate and that has nothing necessarily to do with our body or our anatomy. Would you go along with that, as in that is the perception of those who subscribe to gender identity ideology? Is that what they mean?
Yes, they mean that we all have something inside us that called this gender identity, which alone means whether we're men or women, and that's what determines one or the other. Whereas there's no reason that gender identity needs to exist. It's unprovable, it's unfalsifiable, and it can only be defined in terms of circular reasoning and sexist stereotypes.
But from your perspective, I mean, you're trans,
Yep.
you're a trans woman, so would you say that your gender identity is female and that makes you a woman?
Well, I don't have a gender identity, and I'm certainly not a woman. I'm male, I've had 3 children as a male, so I'm not a woman, women are female. So this idea that we need to base our whole life on having this gender identity is harmful and unnecessary, and it's not doing trans people any favours.
I think people would be confused because that you say you're not a woman, you don't identify as a woman, but you do present as a woman. So, you know, are you not, I mean, is that not just what a woman is? Are you not a woman according to the way that society sees you?
Well, no, a woman is an adult human female, and I'm an adult human male. I just find it more comfortable presenting to society in the same way that women tend to present to society. That makes me more comfortable in society. It also makes me more comfortable in my own body.
I mean, it is interesting because I read Blair White, who's a trans writer in America, and she was saying that if you deny the reality of biological sex, then you're denying trans. Because if there is no biological sex, there is no such thing as trans. And that's an interesting perspective, because I think within all this, a lot of people feel, or at least certain factions of Stonewall, for instance, have presented the idea that the trans community, such as it is homogenous, that everyone within that community feels the same way. I mean, we get it all the time with the gay community, that all gay people vote Labour. Apparently, that's not true. No. So what do you make of that? I mean, can you give us a sense? I mean, I don't want you to speak on behalf of the community, but is there division within is there an argument going on amongst trans people about these issues?
Well, it's what you mean by the trans community. There are trans people, and we transition for all sorts of different reasons. Other people express their gender for all sorts of different reasons. This idea that there is a single trans community is something else which is unnecessary. I identify as a human being, and I make arguments as a human being. I'm not speaking on behalf of trans people generally, and I don't want other trans people to speak on behalf of me. I can stand on my own 2 feet as a human being. So
when it comes to Stonewall, I mean, from what you've written, it's absolutely clear that you don't feel that Stonewall represents you. And I have spoken to a number of gay activists from yesteryear who say that they've actually come out of retirement because they even go so far as to suggest that Stonewall's policy amount to a form of homophobia. Stonewall would say that that's absolutely outrageous and that they are completely opposed to homophobia because, of course, that's their raison d'etre. So if you could tell us a bit about that, why is it that gay people are so upset with Stonewall? Well, it's how Stonewall actually define homosexuality.
Right,
they define
it as somebody who is attracted to the same gender. And then, at the same time, they'll say there's, I don't know how many different genders. We can have gender this, gender that, gender the other. So to be homosexual means you'd have to find somebody of exactly the same gender. It's nonsense. So when did this redefinition happen, according to Stonewall? Because Stonewall used to define gay as being same-sex attracted. And now they define it as same-gender attracted. And a lot of gay activists would say, well, the essence of the struggle for gay rights is an acknowledgement of their biological reality. Do you know when this happened? Well, it goes back to when Stonewall got involved with transgender issues, as you explained before. Section 28, the equalisation of marriage, the equalisation of the age and consent, those had already been done, so Stonewall then got involved in trans issues. I wish they'd stayed away, to be honest. I think they've caused more problems for us than they've solved. And to change the meanings of homosexuality means that they've then sold out their own original community. What is the purpose of Stonewall? But Stonewall would argue that they are explicitly standing up for trans rights, and more than that, they would say that anyone who is criticising them is transphobic and hateful. What do you make of that? Well, they've been calling for example, for the protected characteristic to be changed from gender reassignment, which protects me as something I did, which is a material reality, to gender identity. And I'm not sure gender identity exists. So they're actually they're actually campaigning for the abolition of the protected characteristic that protects me in society.
And can I ask you about this notion of gender-critical feminism and this idea that, because feminists for a long time have argued that the notion of gender is in the performativity of masculinity and femininity, boys wear blue, girls wear pink, all of that is a social construct. So therefore, a young girl who likes football should not be encouraged to think that she might be in the wrong body. And this is where but in addition to that, a lot of feminists are concerned about the notion of single-sex spaces, because women, of course, are overwhelmingly the victims of male violence, and that doesn't go away simply because a perpetrator identifies as a different gender. But of course, I should emphasise here, no feminists aren't suggesting that men are all violent psychopaths, are they? They're concerned about the tiny minority who are. Do you think they have a persuasive view on this, and do you think that message is getting through to the public?
Well, I guess what you're saying is that not all men are like that, but not all trans women are like that either. You know, it's wrong to...
Well, very few, sure.
Yeah, it's wrong to criticise the majority for the actions of a minority. But women have to put barriers up to men because some men are like that.
Yes.
And when it comes to trans women, they'll say, how can you tell the difference between a man and a trans woman? What is the difference?
But there isn't a big epidemic of men identifying as women in order to go into toilets and sexually assault people. That isn't something that's happening all over the place, is it? So why are you worried?
But women need to protect their own spaces, and this enables this is a workaround. So a man can identify as a woman and work around those protections. Those protections become meaningless.
You've written as well about transgender athletes and women's sports. And of course, Caitlyn Jenner got into a lot of trouble for suggesting that it was unfair for trans women to compete against biological women. To what degree is she right?
Well, she's right, yes. You have to come back to the question of why do we segregate sports in the first place? Why don't we all just compete together in open competition? That would be the most inclusive way of...
And do women feel...
sports.
I mean, it's not just about winning the medals, is it? I think that some women feel at risk, physical risk, if they're on a rugby pitch. So with someone who has gone through puberty as a male. I mean, the counter-argument to that is that actually the drugs that people take and the hormones that they take through the transitional process actually mitigates those effects and pretty much levels the playing field. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it doesn't. It nowhere near levels the playing field. I've transitioned. My hormones are in the normal female range, whatever, to use that definition. But my heart is still bigger, my thigh bones are still bigger, my shoulders are still stronger. I've lost some performance, possibly, although I'm getting older, lost my performance. But to say that I'm the same as a woman, somebody who went through female puberty, it's nonsense to try and claim there's some sort of parity there. I've always got an inbuilt advantage. I'm never going to win medals, but at whatever level I compete, I have an advantage being male.
Debbie, thanks so much for being very clear about this, because I think a lot of people are really confused about these issues, so your clarity is really important there. I do want to emphasise that we did ask Stonewall if they wanted to be part of this discussion, but they weren't available. However, they did send this statement. They said, all employers need to ensure that their staff, including LGBTQ+ staff, are free from discrimination and prejudice at work, and our Diversity Champions programme is one way for organisations to be supported to meet this requirement. As with every membership programme, organisations come and go depending on what works best for them at the time, and it's great that organisations can continue this important work on their own. They also added that membership to their Diversity Champions programme actually grew in the last year, and they also added, we're confident that the advice that we give employers is robust. Our advice on the Equality Act is based on the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Equality Act Code of Practice, which was recently reaffirmed in the High Court.